It takes a lot for an independent third-party developer these days to set the world on fire. And more so if your game exists within a genre that has been, quite literally, done to death. 3.5 years ago, developer Techland was able to do just that with Dead Island, thanks to a trailer depicting the violent death of a little girl and her family, played in reverse and set to some somber piano music. Despite being the biggest commercial success of the company, the game was of questionable quality thanks to very repetitive gameplay and one of the most boring stories of the generation. Dead Island had potential to be sure, but it's clear that Techland's vision for an open-world zombie game needed a significant adjustment. Now, a little over a year on since the release of a new generation of hardware and when the zombie genre is seeing some of its greatest fatigue, Techland has unleashed their spiritual successor to its 2011 success with Dying Light, retaining Dead Island's open-world and melee combat-focused themes while throwing in parkour movement and a gameplay-changing day-night cycle. With so many people complaining of zombie fatigue these days though, does Techland's latest deserve to be in the spotlight, or should it just be left to rot in the dark? For 3 months, the Turkish city of Harran has been under military quarantine. Prior to the much-anticipated global athletic games, an unknown virus has swept through the once prosperous town, turning most of the inhabitants into mindless, flesh-eating creatures. In the weeks that have followed, the global relief effort has maintained a steady stream of aerial supply drops to support the remaining survivors that are trapped within the walls of the city. The rest of the world watches from afar as the government plans to firebomb Harran in the hopes of wiping out the infection in just a handful of days. Enter Kyle Crane, a secret operative for the GRE. His mission? Infiltrate the Harran quarantine zone, retrieve classified documents relating to the virus, and escape the city before the purge begins. Of course, just like you would expect, things go belly up from the moment he hits the ground. Ambushed by bandits, Crane unfortunately attracts the attention of the victims of the virus and becomes infected. Rescued by members of the Tower, one of the last remaining strongholds against the undead, Crane must secretly go about completing his objectives while aiding the survivors. When it comes to open-world zombie games, the production budget tends to be put much more into the actual creation of the world around the characters and the events that unfold, rather than the development of the story. Techland seems to be aware that one shouldn't go into a project like this with high hopes for the narrative being the next The Last of Us, and instead chose to develop Dying Light into a serious zombie story with bits of comedy thrown in to try and balance the edginess of the plot. This is almost a repeat of the same storytelling method used for Dead Island, minus the stupidly goofy who do you voodoo bitch character writing the previous game suffered from. The plot of Dying Light clearly desires to be a strong B-action story, but is unfortunately downgraded significantly, thanks to some very weak storytelling and plot decisions that will leave you wondering just what the developers were thinking. Nowhere is this more apparent than when you take a look at the plot structure of Dying Light, and how it interacts with the gameplay. The story itself makes almost no effort to acknowledge the deeds of the player in-game, leaving you with no ability to make a decision for yourself. Kyle Crane, while having a voice and opinions all of his own, isn't offered any moments by which the player can shape the plot, instead taking you on a ride for which you are not offered any control. In addition, the game's multitude of side quests and retrievables have no impact on the progression of the primary storyline, despite implying consequences for the status of many of the game's characters. The biggest example of this failed interaction, though, comes from the game's predominant MacGuffin device, Antizin. In the world of Dying Light, a cure is yet to be developed for the Harran virus. In the meantime, the global relief effort has synthesized a stopgap measure, a suppressant that, when taken regularly, will stabilize an infected person's condition and prevent them from being turned into a zombie. As one of the infected, much of the plot surrounds the acquisition of Antizin, as the two primary factions of the game vie for control of the airdrops that supply the city with his life-saving serum. Theoretically, it should serve as not only one of the primary motivations for our infected protagonist, but also as a gameplay role like what Zombrex is to the infected in Capcom's Dead Rising series. Instead, other than being mentioned as one of the necessities the survivors must seek out to keep from joining the undead populace, Antizin is relegated to being a useless plot device that only serves to connect separate story points. The player is never required to actually obtain Antizin in anything other than the main plot, nor can they do so outside of it. In contrast, it is used as a reminder that the player is on the verge of turning into a flesh eater by having Crane experience seizures at set points in primary story quests. It's a big wasted opportunity for Dying Light, and should have received far better integration into the story than what we see in the final product. Antizin is one of the game's biggest narrative failings, but that doesn't mean that it's alone in bringing down the quality of the story. In fact, the design of the characters themselves dragged the story down as well. Kyle Crane has his own opinions and motivations for what he does throughout the story, as previously mentioned, but the way he expresses these through both dialogue and action make him appear to lack a whole lot of depth. Rise, our main antagonist, feels very stereotypical for the role, as he preaches philosophically to the player while doing terrible deeds like killing his own men. He ends up feeling a lot like a Techland take on Far Cry 3's Voss. But what Voss did for insanity and tormenting the protagonist, Rise fails to really motivate the player through his ruthlessness and anger. Jade, your biggest ally from the tower, and purported to be the biggest badass in Haran, is sadly underutilized, and only gets a brief moment in the spotlight towards the end of the game. Side characters suffer an even more obscure fate, as they seem to simply go away after the plot is done with their storyline. It's a shame. The largest disappointment, however, comes to the way the story comes to a conclusion. Without delving into the realm of spoilers, the game concludes on a mission that feels like it's supposed to be momentous, and yet ends up feeling very disconnected from the rest of the storyline, save for another plot MacGuffin. Several of the events on that mission make almost no narrative sense, and worst of all, it ends the game on a cliffhanger that, almost literally, screams for a sequel from the highest rooftops in order to conclude the overall plot. Something that has become one of the worst sins a developer could make when crafting a story. Dying Light definitely has problems when it comes to its story, and it will require a lot of work in order for a second entry to be worth caring about from a narrative perspective. Don't play Dying Light for the story, as there isn't anything to be excited for here. Techland's latest title definitely doesn't feel like much of a successor when compared to Dead Island from a storytelling perspective, but what it lacks in narrative delivery, it makes up for quite strongly in gameplay systems. At its core, Dying Light is very much just more Dead Island. You're going around a large environment, exploring, gathering and crafting items, and, of course, committing genocide against the undead menace. The comparisons begin to fade thereafter, though, as Techland has implemented a number of significant new systems, as well as improvements to the formula. The biggest and most welcome improvement over the classic formula is easily the new Parkour movement system. A simplified version of the work DICE put into Mirror's Edge, rerunning in Dying Light will be your most frequent activity, as it is very often the best tool you have on hand to stave off death in the hands of the infected. Parkour movement is quite easy to do once you get used to the control scheme, and thanks to a simplified look-then-leap mechanic, you'll find yourself navigating the environment very quickly in no time at all. The system is further improved later on in the game when you unlock the grappling hook, allowing you to, quite literally, climb most buildings in the game in a single bound with just a button. Despite its cooldown and the fact that it isn't very useful against enemies, no, you're not going to be able to reenact living as Scorpion from Mortal Kombat, the grappling hook is an immensely fun tool. Combat in Dying Light follows the standard formula for melee-focused FPS titles these days, like Skyrim and Condemned before it, in which you have the standard amount of light, heavy, and special attacks, whose effectiveness is measured primarily by the strength of the weapon being wielded. It's not all sunshine and roses, though, as the combat does suffer in one distinct department: gunplay. It wouldn't be a zombie game if Techland's latest didn't include firearms to use against both the living and the dead, but, like Dead Island before it, combat with these weapons is rather terrible. The limited variety in the game may be very powerful, but they're all terribly clunky to wield, and cannot be augmented using the crafting system. Several missions in the game all but require using a gun against enemies, but thanks to the hampered mechanics, it ends up making these firefights feel very tedious and uninteresting. This is a big problem that Techland needs to address in the future. Player progression is built upon a set of 3 skill trees focused on the actions you take in the game: Survivor, Agility, and Power. Each one levels up separately from one another and is not pulled collectively, nor do they share earned skill points. Thus, players that focus on parkour and athleticism will earn agility points, while those that focus on combat and zombie killing will earn power points respectively. Every action you take, from hitting a zombie to climbing a ledge, earns you points, and the game constantly reminds you of that thanks to numbers that appear on the screen and slowly fill the XP bars for each skill set that is constantly on top of your HUD. The survivor skill tree, the exception to these rules, is earned through quest completion and, unlike the other two, is subject to player fail conditions, but more on that in a minute. Based on your playstyle, it is quite easy to find yourself quickly leveling up one tree over the other, which can be quite hazardous. Dying Light would have definitely benefited from a shared skill point pool, rather than forcing the player to focus on one ability set over the other to become stronger, faster character, but this is a nitpick that many will more than likely not mind. One of the most prominent features Techland chose to include in Dying Light is the much publicized day-night cycle. Players will spend roughly 50 minutes of each hour in daylight completing whatever they please. However, as the day winds down and the sun begins to set, the player begins to receive radio warnings that heed survivors into safe zones. As your watch beeps to warn you of the impending nightfall, and you begin to hear inhuman howls in the distance, the player is granted access to the nighttime sequence, and it is here in which the game changes tone completely, from a zombie-killing playground to that of a stealth-based horror title. Nighttime sequences are an accelerated period of time lasting only 10 minutes apiece, but for that brief span of time, the game forces you to completely change your in-game discretion regarding combat and exposure. In the night appear volatiles, a zombie type that are both exceptionally vicious and fast in hunting down the player and chasing them in the dark. The player's minimap shows their cone of vision a la classic Metal Gear Solid, and if you're caught in their gaze for too long, the pursuit begins. At this point, only much more leveled up players have the realistic option of engaging the attackers, as lower level characters don't have access to the tools necessary to make staying out at night anything but a hard prospect. To prevent the player from simply retreating to a safe zone and resting until daylight, Dying Light includes a few measures that make staying out at night more enticing. Beyond just the inclusion of high reward quests that take place only at night, the nighttime sequences double the amount of agility and power XP that you can earn. Smart players can quickly level up during this short period by simply forcing a chase to occur and escaping successfully, which yields a massive dump of points to both skill trees. Though this is not encouraged early on in the game, mid-level players will benefit tremendously if they are able to survive the night. Sadly, it is the day-night cycle wherein I find one of the biggest missed opportunities for Dying Light: time management. Throughout the course of the game, the player is constantly given deadlines, time spans, and reminders of the importance and necessity of their actions. From radio calls warning of the impending destruction of Iran in just a few days' time, to retrieving flesh from a special zombie type at night for study that needs to arrive in less than a few hours, the game seems determined to press you on your progress. Despite this, the game makes no effort to actually make you proceed in as timely manner as possible. There are no actual time limits in the game at all. This is of course to say nothing of Antizin being a story gimmick to move the plot along, and not also a gameplay opportunity. Allowing players the freedom to do whatever they want, whenever they want, is fine in a lot of open world games, but in one such as this, stressing the player with time management can actually make for a better game. Fail conditions for Dying Light are curiously worked into the experience. Death, of course, is never the end in video games, but the measure by which the player is punished for such an occurrence encourages the player to engage in a playstyle you wouldn't expect: suicide runs. Like only a few games before it, such as Red Faction Guerrilla, outside of a core story mission, death does not reset the state of the world, instead allowing it to continue on as if you didn't actually die. Players will respawn nearby, back to full health, and can immediately return to whatever they were doing before, with all the conditions that existed beforehand still going on. Die at the hand of a few bandits, but manage to kill one or two, returning to that spot will see the exact same scenarios still there. It's a strange design choice to not punish the player like any other game, and given that the only penalty the player incurs is the loss of survivor points towards their next skill level, it almost feels like cheating. Though I don't want to advocate for strict penalties for players, the game would benefit from providing a greater incentive to stay alive as much as possible in the face of dying on purpose to make subsequent lives easier. Despite these flaws though, Dying Light remains a rather entertaining experience. The game is best played in co-op, of course, but the single player is no slouch by comparison. The second year of the console generation has begun, and though we are certain to receive a number of cross-generation titles that are bound to hold back the potential of several games, Techland made the decision just a scant few months ago to make sure that Dying Light would not be hampered by a last-gen release, shifting development of the game to PC, PS4, and Xbox One only. Has it helped though? Well, I can't say for certain considering I don't believe the game was ever demonstrated on the PS3 or 360, but I can suggest that the game can be rather stunning to look at. Environmental design throughout the game is rather gorgeous, and goes a long way towards selling a segmented, rapidly transitioning city. From the slums where you start out, to an old colonial section of Haran, you get the sense this time around that this is more of a city than Dead Islands ever could be. A dynamic weather system is included and really adds flavor to the areas you're in. Watching storms sweep into the area as the clouds darken and the trees blow in the wind, it all looks great. The letdown, however, comes from the game's variety of environments. At any high point in the game, you can glance off into the distance, where you will see a sprawling city filled with skyscrapers, as well as mountains that would be great to visit. Sadly, those do not exist, as is the fate of many mentioned but viewable locations, the most egregious of which being the Haran Stadium where the much-touted global games competition was supposed to take place, and has been relegated to paid-for DLC. It's not a bad effort for a first game, but Haran would definitely stand for some more places to explore. Though the public didn't begin to take notice of Dead Island until after the infamous trailer for it was revealed, Techland first started talking about Dead Island long before any gameplay was revealed. Several years prior to release, the most publicized element of their eventual product was a real-time character deformation system that was just as gruesome looking as one could imagine. Sadly, Dead Island launched without this as it was very performance intensive. Dying Light, however, seems to have incorporated at least some of the deformation system. Combat with zombies will result in gruesome violence, though it is limited to limb, pelvic, and head damage. Still though, enemies before, during, and after battle are disgustingly detailed in rather fantastic ways. From the exposed rib cages of a walker making his way towards you, to the blood-drenched torso of a zombie you just cleaved in two, Dying Light features some of the most grisly violence to be seen this side of Mortal Kombat. It is glorious. Audio design is well done, for the most part. Ambient environment sounds are nicely done, and do well to sell the area you're in. The game's rather interesting soundtrack sticks to the idea of the game being a horror film by including an entirely synth-focused score that feels ripped straight out of the 80s. The voice work does show some significant improvements over Dead Island, and though characters' feelings come across decently, the emotional punch is hampered by the animation of the people on screen. Dying Light, it seems, reserved a lot of its mocap budget for only select cinematics, and only in these do we really get a sense for the cast's emotional canvas. In short, Techland did a rather great job this time around, from a production standpoint. There is, of course, room for improvement, but this is a nice demonstration of the potential of the current generation of systems. The latest game from developer Techland promises a lot of things. They want to tell you that this is a next-generation zombie game filled with incredibly brutal combat, an exceptional parkour system, and horrific, challenging enemies. Does Dying Light match those descriptions, though? Well, mostly. Dying Light is what Dead Island should have been. A well-done open-world zombie game with strong combat and a reason to be afraid of the dark. However, it's riddled with questionable design choices and flaws that hamper the overall experience. If you can look past these inconsistencies and the game's lacking story, you're in for a rather good time.